Thomas Allison, and this paper looks at the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion in crowdfunding. The thing that motivated this research was to understand the differences in funders and how they affect crowdfunding performance using the persuasion model from elaboration likelihood. Right. There were a number of challenges. In crowdfunding, a lot of prior studies have just sort of used information that's on the page to look at the impact of issue-relevant information, and peripheral cues required us to code hundreds of crowdfunding projects. So looking at them manually, having multiple coders evaluate what information was present in each project and what information wasn't present, and then constructing a model using the full elaboration likelihood model for one of the first times in entrepreneurship that shows how the presence of that information influences fundraising performance. What we found was that, as predicted by the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, that in fact crowdfunding is well explained by a persuasive model, especially when we're looking at rewards-based crowdfunding, which is sites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo. And one of the most exciting things was that we found moderating effects. So things that impacted crowdfunder decision models, such as how much funding was requested or how much prior experience they had in crowdfunding. In fact, it impacted which information they looked at, whether they were more influenced by more emotional-based peripheral cues, or whether they put more weight on to issue-relevant information, which is more sort of a logical decision process. So we looked at sort of the average among all the funders. So we looked at among the funders who supported the project, how much prior experience did they have, and for the motivation factor, we looked at sort of what were the rewards offered and how much money was required to get each reward. Well, what's very exciting about this paper is that the implications for practitioners are actually quite clear. Right? So the type of crowdfunding pitch and approach that you make to investors should be very heavily influenced by what you're asking from them. Right? If you're asking for just a few dollars to support sort of a small project, then it's sufficient to rely on more emotion-based factors, right? So peripheral cues, talking about how doing this is your dream, and factors such as that. On the other hand, if you're asking for a lot of money from each individual person, $100 or more, then you really actually have to make more of a persuasive argument based on logic, based on how much experience you have, right? And trying to show that you're going to be able to do this to the potential crowdfunders. So in this study, our findings had the most relevance for reward-based crowdfunding, but of course there's equity crowdfunding and debt-based crowdfunding also. The things that we found to be important in this study have quite a bit of relevance for debt-based crowdfunding too, because the factors that we found through the elaboration likelihood model that influence the provision of funds are pretty common with debt-based crowdfunding, because in debt-based crowdfunding, funders are concerned with the probability of repayments. So in our study, we're looking at the factors that influence the perception that the reward will eventually be provided. On the other hand, in equity-based crowdfunding, funders are concerned with the agency questions, right? How likely is this crowdfunder to pursue the best interest of the firm, right? Versus are they going to fall to agency conflict? So further investigation, especially for equity crowdfunding, is definitely plausible. I think Persuasion has a lot of promise in investigating equity crowdfunding, and hope for further research along those lines. Well, the implications for funders are, again, quite straightforward in our study. So funders, crowdfunders, people who are providing money to entrepreneurs, are shown in our study to be quite rational, right? So when the stakes are low, they don't spend a lot of time and use heuristics or peripheral cues to sort of shorten the decision process. And really, we think that makes a lot of sense, right? When there are a few dollars at stake, it makes not a lot of sense to think very carefully, spend a lot of time evaluating information about the entrepreneur and the project. On the other hand, for funders, if you're being asked to provide $100 or more, you really should be thinking very carefully about what's the background of this person, the project, right? What resources do they have that make it likely that this is actually going to happen? So we would definitely encourage potential investors in a crowdfunding project, when the amounts that they're being asked are significant, you need to be doing some due diligence. And that's what we find happens with the funders in our model. We would definitely encourage that. There's a growing interest in crowdfunding, and the reasons I think are quite straightforward. You need money for almost any entrepreneurial venture. Most entrepreneurs are not able to marshal much money personally, and if they themselves have little money, their family and friends likely don't either. A vanishingly small percentage of ventures ever receive outside equity from angel investors or venture capital. Typically it's less than 1/10 of 1%. And so there's tons of great ideas and great entrepreneurs out there that need money and can't get it through traditional channels. Crowdfunding of all flavors provides a great opportunity for that. And so I'm pretty convinced that there'll be a lot more interest in this research area in the future. Okay. The elaboration likelihood model of persuasion is a two-factor model. So it presumes that there's a main path, right, where people consider cognitively issue-relevant information, make logical decisions about whether a product or a venture is worth their support. And there's also something called the peripheral path, where people's perceptions of peripheral cues influence their emotions, right? And so if those emotions cause them to think more seriously about the venture, then they might switch to the main path, right? So there's sort of two different paths that people can arrive at seriously considering the venture. In addition, there's other factors that can influence whether a person considers issue-relevant information or peripheral cues more strongly. In our paper, we're among the first to actually model those moderators.